Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for having me today. My topic is the dangers of a sanitized education, or subtitled The Hoax of Critical Race Theory. And this topic came to my attention because of the laws that have recently been passed in Texas and in other places, sort of providing guidance as to how history and social studies should be taught. So, since history is the primary focus of it, I'd like to start there. About history, well, two sayings about history that you've probably heard. Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. And the good question is the only lesson of history to be that mankind is unteachable. Well, I hope that the answer to Winston Churchill's question is no, that's not the only lesson. But both of these quotes point to the reason that we bother to study history, and that is to learn from it so that we can not repeat the mistakes we've made in the past and perhaps learn what we've done in the past to help correct some problems that are in our present. So about history, well, history is a factual account of what really happened and what we really were. Now, the problem is that we often don't distinguish that history from our myths. And a myth is what we'd like to believe happened and what we'd like to think we were. For example, my favorite example of this is the
Excuse
Battle of New Orleans in the
Ernie,
War of
we're not
1812.
seeing we're not seeing your Zoom, your slides. We're seeing just your Zoom screen right now. So if you have a PowerPoint, you might have click on that on your, there you go. Click on your PowerPoint because we're seeing your Zoom screen.
Okay.
And I'm getting some comments here. So find your PowerPoint on your slide share.
Let's do this again. Sorry about that.
Okay, that's okay. I know you had some slides and I didn't want you to get off course. There you go.
All right.
All right. Thank you, Ernie. Sorry for the
Thank
interruption.
you. Well, the point that I was making is that we often confuse history and myth. And to give you an example of the myth that I'm talking about, Battle of New Orleans in the War of 1812, the myth says that the battle was won by a bunch of American sharpshooters who hid behind trees and picked off redcoats as they went along. The real history of the battle is more like this. They had a fairly incompetent general on the British side who literally paused his army right under the guns of the American army. They started firing cannons and pretty well destroyed the British army. It was because of the cannons, not because of the sharpshooters. But sharpshooters makes a whole lot better myth, so that's what we like to believe. All right, the Texas law. There's actually two laws that Texas has passed. One passed in the full session last spring, and the other passed in the special session, the second special session. And what they tell us, they're both very long bills, but this is sort of the high points. The first is that controversial issues must be dealt with in an impartial manner, looking at both sides. Students should not be made to feel uncomfortable because of their gender or their race. And then it provides a long list of what should be taught. SB 3, which passed in the special session, requires that at least one teacher and administrator from each school attend a course on social studies, a course to be developed by the State Board of Education. It bans required participation or credit for taking part in organizations that somehow lobby elected officials or ask them to take certain positions. It requires a study of how to deal with information, which I think is a good thing, actually. And it cannot teach that one race is or sex is superior. And it cannot teach that any race or sex is responsible for what's done in the past. In fact, one of the bills says something like, you cannot teach that slavery and Jim Crow is anything other than an aberration from the American normal. So those are the bills that we talked about. Both of them are based on the premise of critical race theory. Governor Abbott, in fact, went so far as to say that his goal was to banish critical race theory from the state of Texas. Now, I would guess that none of the people who authored these bills or voted for them could define critical race theory, but this is one definition. By the way, I'm a history buff, and I'm also a sort of a public policy buff, and I had never heard of critical race theory until a few months ago. So I had to find a definition as well when people started talking about it. Critical race theory does not attribute racism to white people as individuals or even to entire groups of people. It states that U.S. institutions, criminal justice, education, labor, housing, healthcare, are laced with racism embedded in laws, regulations, rules, and procedures that lead to different outcomes by race. In other words, we have institutional racism in this country. Now, this name is not listed in the law itself. And I guess the fear was that this theory would somehow take over our public schools and put the blame for everything that's wrong with our country on white people and calling them racist. In point of fact, this was dreamt up by several right-wing think tanks, Heritage Foundation among them. And it was promulgated by several right-wing media outlets, all the usual suspects. And of course, it was picked up by politicians who are using it as another cultural trudgeon. So why am I concerned about this? Well, first of all, these laws are going to chill teachers. Absolutely everything cannot be discussed without bias or through several perspectives. Think about if you're teaching slavery. On the one hand, and on the other hand, I don't think there is on another hand. It cuts students' options. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. State-sponsored training. You have people with degrees and advanced degrees and lots of experience, and now they're going to go to a course put together by the state of Texas to tell them how to teach. That sort of troubles me. And then probably worst of all, it helps to perpetuate the myths, making it difficult to see the real problems that exist. Let's talk about the chilling impacts. History is a whole bunch more than dates and great men, although that's the way it's usually taught. And social studies is a whole lot more than knowing that there are 3 branches of government or 9 justices on the Supreme Court. To really understand something, you have to engage actively with that idea, that institution or an event. And that's what a good teacher is all about, helping students to engage. My fear is that with the prospect of citizens waving SB 3 over their heads and demanding discipline, teachers are going to be reluctant to try to bring about that engagement. In fact, we see that already. One principal here in Texas is on the verge of being terminated because good citizens showed up at a board meeting and cried out critical race theory, and the board suspended him, and the recommendation made by the administrator is that his contract not be renewed. There was absolutely no process and no evidence that he was doing anything untoward. So it's chilling. Learning. Everyone doesn't learn best from books. Some learn best from experience. In fact, I would argue probably most learn best from experience. credits or even required activity encourages those experiences. If you want to have someone learn about civic involvement, the very best way is to have them take part in different organizations, the League of Women Voters, various conservation organizations, the church, anything that gets them out into the community and helps them understand what the issues are and how the process works for dealing with those issues. So if you want people to really learn, you have to give them options. You can't just put a book in front of them and say, hey, learn this. The training requirement. As I said, if you have 4 years in school and you've probably gone through an internship to get your teacher certificate, and you probably have a master's degree, an awful lot of public school teachers do, and you probably have a lot of experience in the classroom, now you're going to be required to go to a training opportunity put together by the state of Texas to tell you how to teach properly. I find that disturbing, to say the least, because, well, if you're educated in an area and you have experience in it, then I don't think that a short course from a public agency is going to improve your skills a whole lot. The whole notion of myth versus history. A bunch of what we teach in K-12 is much closer to myth than it is history. For example, when you were in public school, what did you learn about Black history? Give you an example. A long time ago, I was a history teacher for a short time. And about halfway through the first semester, I said to my teachers, it's a large school, there were several history teachers, I suggested that we do something on Black history. And their first response was, well, if you do that, be ready for some pushback. And so we ended up doing 2 days, 1 day of lecture and 1 day of discussion on Black history. And surprisingly, there was no pushback in this all-white school that I was working in. But it was the first time that had happened ever in this school. And I don't think that experience is all that abnormal. Similarly, what did you learn about Native Americans? Their history, their culture, the real history of what happened after the arrival of Europeans. What did you learn about non-English settlements? The Dutch were here, the French were here, the Spaniards were here before the English made it to North America. But almost all that you read about in history books is about the English experience. What did you learn about Mexican settlements here in Texas, pre-revolution or post-revolution for that matter? Or what did you learn about women in history? All of these point to the fact that what we learn is sort of a great man, great document, wars, explorers, and innovations kind of history, which doesn't help us a whole lot in understanding how we got to where we are or where we're going. Now, learning from history. As the 2 quotes that I shared with you early on suggest, the reason that we study history is so that we can learn about our past and better understand our present. You can't learn from something that you don't know. And if what you know is the myth rather than the actual history, chances are you're not going to be able to learn very much. You can't correct a problem if you don't recognize that it exists. And racism is a problem in our country. It's been a part of us forever. And as the events of the last couple of years have clearly demonstrated with George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Black Lives Matter protests and all the rest, the victims are getting tired of it, and they should be. The beneficiaries are also getting scared that somehow the privilege that they have held forever might be somehow in danger. And too many of us sit back and don't understand and don't acknowledge that this problem exists. Therefore, it's going to be really tough to solve it. And one of the other things that we have difficulty understanding is the difference between individual and institutional racism. If you could see my hair, which you can't see very much of, and if you could tell that there was a color in it once, it was blonde. And my eyes are blue. I'm very definitely of North European stock. So if I somehow feel better than people who don't look like me, who might have different skin color or different hair or different cultural experience, or if I feel uncomfortable around such people, I would say that that's unfortunate. I would say it's sad, but it's hardly catastrophic. It's a reaction of two people to each other. Now, the flip side of that is if you have a state program that is crafted in such a way that eliminates certain people from participation, I would say that could be catastrophic. If you have a business practice that deprives some people of essential services, that could be catastrophic. If you have a law that effectively targets one group over another, that could certainly be problematic. Now, among the things that we didn't learn in school is that that kind of institutional racism continues in our country. This is a 1935 map of San Antonio. And you can see the different colors in the map. That marks out the places where people of different races lived. And it was published by the Homeowners Loan Corporation, which was a federal corporation designed to assist banks in supporting loans for home ownership as part of the New Deal. And that's the origin of the term redlining. Guess which areas were promoted for loans and which areas were not. If you superimposed a map of current San Antonio on this, you would see that the areas with the highest poverty concentrations pretty much coincide with the areas that are in red and yellow on this map. And it's the result of redlining from a federal agency. And fortunately, redlining has been illegal for quite some time now, but the residual effects are still there. This is from the Federal Reserve of St. Louis, and it shows you the median wealth held by families in this country. And you can see in 2016, the median wealth of a white family was $163,000. The median wealth of a black family was $16,000, a tenfold difference. Now, think about the slide you saw before. Most families in this country accumulate wealth because of their investment in a home. And they pass wealth along in large part because of that wealth accumulated from their home. So generation to generation, this perpetuates itself. And we have a continuation of this process where Black people are at a disadvantage because of historic redlining, in part because of historic redlining. Another thing, you probably have read that the United States locks up a greater proportion of its citizens than any other country in the world, including countries like China or Russia. But who it locks up is also very significant. First of all, we lock up a lot more men than women. And if you're a white man in this country, the chances of you becoming involved in our prison system is 1 in 17. Flip side of that, if you're a black man, the chances are 1 in 3 that you could become involved in our system. And if you're Latinx, the chances are 1 in 6. Now, what can you conclude from that? Well, one conclusion is, I suppose, that black and brown people are just a whole lot more sinister folks and break the law more often and therefore get locked up more often. Another is that there's probably more policing in neighborhoods where those folks live, and that the sentencing might be different, and in fact that the laws might be different. An example, another topic that our folks in Austin have been all uptight about is election integrity. Well, we have a black man in Texas who is facing many years in prison because he voted about 30 days before he was officially off paper. That is, before he was officially off of probation. And he didn't realize that he wasn't eligible to vote. And it was one vote. But because of that error, he violated the law, and the state of Texas thinks he ought to be locked up for quite a while because of it. Now, the flip side of that is there's a man in Pennsylvania, a white man, who forged his dead mother's signatures to use her voting rights to cast a ballot. In that case, happened to be a Republican ballot too. And he got basically a slap on the wrist. So we have a very different treatment of people in this country based on race. And I would submit that that's a remnant of institutional racism. All right, well, where does all this lead us? Well, this is a quote that I ran across the other day from a man named LeGarrette King, who is the director of the Carter Center for K-12 Public Education in the University of Missouri. And he said, referring to students, they're really hurt that this history wasn't taught to them in school. If future citizens are only learning about half the population, well, that's how we end up in the place we're in. If they knew this history, hopefully they would improve our society, because we don't want to repeat it. Somehow that pretty well summarizes what my message is today and why I have concerns about this. If you're interested in this topic and want to learn more about it, I offer several things because I gave you a half-inch deep run through it just now. The first is an article, actually a blog post by my friend Diane Andy, who monitors educational topics for the Texas League of Women Voters. And you can see her title is Regarding Anti-Critical Theory Bills. And you can find it there. Another is a wonderful article in The Nation magazine just a month or so ago, entitled Radical Capitalists Behind Critical Race Theory Fervor. And it demonstrates quite clearly that this is an AstroTurf set of concerns again, funded by people who back conservative and extreme causes, and promulgated by folks who also back them. A book that's gotten a lot of attention in the Capitol, Forget the Alamo. The title is sort of unfortunate because it's provocative and it doesn't have to be, but it's a great book. And it's great because, among other things, it points out that Mexican American folks in Texas have suffered many of the same racial issues as Black. And one of the more interesting tidbits in it, it interviews Mexican American students who were taught Texas history in public schools. And they give their reaction to what they learned. And what they learned basically said that they were descended from bad people, and it made them feel like the other. The Great Dissenter. This is a biography of Justice John Marshall Harlan, who was from Kentucky. He served on the United States Supreme Court in the last decades of the 18th century and the early decades of the 20th century. And he was called the Great Dissenter because he wrote a number of very important dissenting opinions. One of them was in Plessy versus Ferguson. And those dissents became the basis of revised court-made law many, many years later. Gordon Reed's book, Juneteenth, is a series of essays written by a Black woman historian who grew up in Southeast Texas. And it gives you a very different view of some aspects of Texas history. It's well worth the read. Stamped from the Beginning, the title actually comes from a speech given by then Senator Jefferson Davis. And it is sort of an intellectual history of racism in this country. And he does kind of an interesting job using what he calls guides from history, starting with Cotton Mather and ending up with Angela Davis. And if you're interested in that subject, it's well worth the read. And finally, McGee's book, The Sum of Us, does a super job of demonstrating that racism costs our entire society. So if you have nothing to do next weekend, there are some books for you to read.